What if the United States had split apart 30 years before the Civil War officially began? What if the Union had collapsed in the 1830s, long before Abraham Lincoln, long before Fort Sumter, long before the country fully understood how deep its divisions ran? It almost happened. In 1832, the United States faced a political crisis so intense that many feared it would lead to armed conflict between a state and the federal government. The issue was not a battlefield invasion. It was not a foreign power. It was something arguably more dangerous, a growing belief that a state could simply ignore federal law. This confrontation became known as the Nullification Crisis. To understand why this moment was so explosive, we have to look at tariffs. In 1828, Congress passed a high protective tariff designed to support American manufacturing, particularly in the North. These tariffs made imported goods more expensive, encouraging Americans to buy domestic products. Northern industrial states largely supported the measure. Southern states, especially South Carolina, strongly opposed it. The Southern economy relied heavily on agriculture and international trade. Higher tariffs meant higher costs for imported goods and the risk of foreign retaliation against American exports like cotton. Critics in the South labeled it the tariff of abominations. But the argument quickly became about more than economics. It became constitutional. South Carolina leaders, including Vice President John C. Calhoun, argued that states had the right to nullify or invalidate federal laws they believed were unconstitutional. The theory suggested that because states had created the federal government, they retained the authority to reject its overreach. In 1832, South Carolina took a dramatic step. A state convention passed the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1830 null and void within the state's borders. They even warned that if the federal government attempted to enforce the tariffs by force, South Carolina would consider secession. This was not symbolic. It was a direct challenge to federal authority. And the man in the White House at the time was President Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a Southerner, a slaveholder, and a strong believer in states' rights in many contexts. But he was also a fierce defender of the Union. To him, nullification was not just a policy disagreement. It was a threat to national survival. In a powerful proclamation to the people of South Carolina, Jackson declared that nullification was incompatible with the existence of the Union. He made it clear that he was prepared to enforce federal law. Behind the scenes, he quietly began preparing military options in case the situation escalated. Congress responded by passing the Force Bill in 1833, which authorized the president to use military force, if necessary, to ensure that federal laws were executed. For the first time, the possibility of armed conflict between the state and the federal government felt real. At the same time, Senator Henry Clay worked on a compromise. The compromise tariff of 1833 gradually reduced tariff rates over time, offering South Carolina a way to step back without losing face. In the end, South Carolina rescinded its nullification of the tariffs, though in a symbolic move, it nullified the Force Bill instead. The immediate crisis passed. Shots were never fired. The Union held together. But the tension did not disappear. The Nullification Crisis revealed a deep and unresolved question. Who ultimately held sovereignty, the states or the federal government? That question would resurface again and again in the coming decades, especially over the issue of slavery. The arguments made in 1832 would echo loudly in 1860 and 1861 when Southern states began seceding. After Abraham Lincoln's election, the Civil War did not emerge from nowhere. It grew out of earlier confrontations like this one. The almost civil war before the Civil War showed just how fragile the Union could be. It exposed how economic disputes could transform into constitutional battles. And it demonstrated that strong personalities, like Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun, could shape the course of national history. What makes this episode so powerful is how close it came to disaster. The country was still young. The Constitution was only a few decades old. There was no guarantee the federal system would survive such a direct challenge, yet the Union endured. The crisis also set a precedent. It reinforced the idea that the federal government had ultimate authority to enforce its laws. At the same time, it left unresolved the deeper moral and political conflicts dividing the nation. History often focuses on a civil war as the great breaking point, but sometimes the near misses tell us just as much. The Nullification Crisis reminds us that the United States has faced internal division before. It has wrestled with questions about power, identity, and unity since its earliest decades. The country did not fall apart in 1832, but the warning signs were there. The debate over states' rights versus federal authority did not end with compromise. It simply paused. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: nations are tested not only by external enemies, but by internal disagreements. The strength of a system is measured by how it resolves conflict without destroying itself. In the 1830s, America stood on the edge of an internal rupture. It stepped back. A generation later, it would not. That is why this almost forgotten crisis matters. It was a preview of the storm that was still to come.